right. So we're beginning on Mark chapter 14 and going to try to get to the end. I think we can do it.
All right, I'll start.
All right.
It was 2 days before the Passover and the festival of unleavened bread. The chief priests and the scribes were looking for a way to arrest Jesus by stealth and kill him, for they said, "Not during the festival, or there may be a riot among the people." While he was at Bethany in the house of Simon the leper, as he sat at the table, a woman came with an alabaster jar of very costly ointment of nard, and she broke open the jar and poured the ointment on his head. But some were there who said to one another in anger, "Why was the ointment wasted in this way? For this ointment could have been sold for more than 300 denarii, and the money given to the poor." And they scolded her. But Jesus said, "Let her alone. Why do you trouble her? She has performed a good service for me. For you always have the poor with you, and you can show kindness to them whenever you wish, but you will not always have me. She has done what she could. She has anointed my body beforehand for its burial. Truly I tell you, wherever the good news is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will be told in remembrance of her." Then Judas Iscariot, who was one of the 12, went to the chief priests in order to betray him to them. When they heard it, they were greatly pleased and promised to give him money. So he began to look for an opportunity to betray him. On the first day of unleavened bread, when the Passover lamb is sacrificed, his disciples said to him, "Where do you want us to go and make the preparations for you to eat the Passover?" So he sent 2 of his disciples, saying to them, "Go into the city, and a man carrying a jar of water will meet you. Follow him, and wherever he enters, say to the owner of the house, 'The teacher asks, where is my guest room where I may eat the Passover with my disciples?' He will show you a large room upstairs, furnished and ready. Make preparations for us there." So the disciples set out and went to the city and found everything as he had told them, and they prepared the Passover meal. When it was evening, he came with the 12, and when they had taken their places and were eating, Jesus said, "Truly I tell you, one of you will betray me, one who is eating with me." They began to be distressed and to say to him, one after another, "Surely not I." He said to them, "It is one of the 12, one who is dipping bread into the bowl with me. For the Son of Man goes as it is written of him. But woe to that one by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It would have been better for that one not to have been born." While they were eating, he took a loaf of bread, and after blessing it, he broke it, gave it to them, and said, "Take, this is my body." Then he took a cup, and after giving thanks, he gave it to them, and all of them drank from it. He said to them, "This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many. Truly I tell you, I will never again drink of the fruit of the vine until that day when I drink it new in the kingdom of God."
Yeah, let's stop there.
Okay.
So, a couple things about the anointing in Bethany. I have to remember that this is in all 4 Gospels, but how it's told is different.
Mm-hmm.
And in this one, she's not described as a sinner. That's a different gospel. In John, it's actually Mary of Bethany thanking Jesus for rising her brother from the dead. Here, it's just a woman who's doing something nice, and she's scolded. So it's possible, as some people have said, that this might be Mary Magdalene, who's just showing a beautiful act. Not because she's a sinner, she's just showing a beautiful act to Jesus. But a lot of people feel as if Mary Magdalene's, like, she was such a powerful person, they had to include some of her stories, but they took away her power by changing, like taking away the name, or even breaking her up and saying, okay, well, it's Martha, it's Mary, it's instead of it being this particular person.
Interesting.
I don't know, but there's a legend that Mary Magdalene was a miraphor, and part of that is you are an anointing person. You anoint people who are sick before they die. It's like a priestess type of role. And so when he says she's anointed my body before its burial, it makes me think miraphor. And Jesus would have honored that and seen that as a powerful role. So.
Well, in here, it's she pours ointment on his head, but then in others, isn't it, she pours it on his feet and wipes them with her hair?
Yes. Yeah, so at least in the one where, I think it's Matthew, where she's a sinner, and she cries on his feet and wipes that with her hair. I don't remember the other ones, but yeah.
It's just interesting.
And then Judas.
Yeah.
Judas is such an interesting character. I always sort of feel like he's a great example of someone who just, none of the disciples fully understood Jesus, but Judas is sort of the prime example of someone who really didn't. And it's a great reminder that we can have, even though we go to church, even though we're like really into religion, we can miss the point. And I think Judas is a great example of that. And then to be even crazier, I'm reading a book right now. It's like the father of yoga, the guy who brought it from India over.
Okay.
And it's a super thick autobiography. And the amount of times he references Jesus in the Gospels is like way more than I ever would have thought. And apparently in Hinduism, they have no sense of like, at least like some of the guru people, they don't see Hinduism as like, we're right and everyone else is wrong. They think enlightened is enlightened is enlightened. And so they talk about Jesus as being an enlightened guru who's like mastered the stuff. And they're like, ah, yes. Like everything he does, they're like, ah, yes. But they also believe in reincarnation. And they believe that in good karma and bad karma. And when Jesus says it would have been better that that one not have been born, this is the first time I've read that as saying, if Jesus and other people in that time believed in reincarnation, Jesus is saying if he hadn't been born into this life, he wouldn't be getting this bad karma. But that doesn't mean that Jesus wishes he never existed.
Right.
It just means the role he played was giving him a lot of bad karma he was going to have to burn off later. Which is fascinating.
Yeah, well, and I mean, there was no lead up to it here either. Like, it's just, oh, now Judas decided he was going to betray him. Like, why?
I know, we never see in any of the Gospels an argument or any reasoning. So, my favorite version of Judas is in the movie Mary Magdalene, which came out like 5 years ago. And Judas is someone who lost his entire family to the violence of the Romans.
Oh, do we know that? Like historically?
No.
Okay.
What we do know is that he was a zealot. So he was furious at the Romans, so they basically made this cause up. And in the movie, so they're expounding on this a little bit, he was so excited about Jesus because he thought Jesus was the right person to go up against the Romans. And so it's so sweet. They kind of breaks your heart. But then on Palm Sunday, he's so excited, and there's like almost like a riot of noises, and he goes, "Now's the time, Jesus, now's the time." And then Jesus just leaves the temple, and you just see him, it's like his world shatters. And like the whole reason he followed Jesus was for revenge on behalf of his children and his wife and his family. And he suddenly realizes he's not going to get that.
Yeah. That's heartbreaking, really.
It is. It is. And so the whole movie just paints him as just this sweet, just hurting guy.
Yeah.
Which I think in some ways is having compassion on all of these different people is a good thing. Because they were all stuck in some sort of thinking.
Well, and you can see how he would absolutely be stuck. Like, he couldn't see what Jesus was offering because he was driven by revenge and pain.
And that makes sense. Like, I've never had the experience in my life where something so awful has happened to me or my loved ones that I've been tested to forgive that way.
Exactly.
It's easy for me to talk about forgiveness when nothing really bad has happened to me.
Right. No one's murdered your kids.
No, right.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Should I keep going?
Yeah.
Are we on 26?
I think so, yeah.
Okay. When they had sung the hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives. And Jesus said to them, "You will all become deserters, for it is written, 'I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep will be scattered.' But after I am raised up, I will go before you to Galilee." Peter said to him, "Even though all become deserters, I will not." Jesus said to him, "Truly I tell you, this day, this very night, before the cock crows twice, you will deny me 3 times." But he said vehemently, "Even though I must die with you, I will not deny you." And all of them said the same. They went to a place called Gethsemane, and he said to his disciples, "Sit here while I pray." He took with him Peter and James and John, and began to be distressed and agitated. And he said to them, "I am deeply grieved, even to death. Remain here and keep awake." And going a little farther, he threw himself on the ground and prayed that if it were possible, the hour might pass from him. He said, "Abba, Father, for you all things are possible. Remove this cup from me. Yet not what I want, but what you want." He came and found them sleeping, and he said to Peter, "Simon, are you asleep? Could you not keep awake 1 hour? Keep awake and pray that you may not come into the time of trial. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak." And again he went away and prayed, saying the same words. And once more he came and found them sleeping, for their eyes were very heavy, and they did not know what to say to him. He came a 3rd time and said to them, "Are you still sleeping and taking your rest? Enough. The hour has come. The Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Get up, let us be going. See, my betrayer is at hand." Immediately, while he was still speaking, Judas, one of the 12, arrived. And with him there was a crowd with swords and clubs, from the chief priests, the scribes, and the elders. Now the betrayer had given them a sign, saying, "The one I will kiss is the man. Arrest him and lead him away under guard." So when he came, he went up to him at once and said, "Rabbi," and kissed him. Then they laid hands on him and arrested him. But one of those who stood near drew his sword and struck the slave of the high priest, cutting off his ear. Then Jesus said to them, "Have you come out with swords and clubs to arrest me, as though I were a bandit? Day after day I was with you in the temple teaching, and you did not arrest me. But let the scriptures be fulfilled." All of them deserted him and fled. A certain young man was following him, wearing nothing but a linen cloth. They caught hold of him, but he left the linen cloth and ran off naked. They took Jesus to the high priest, and all the chief priests, the elders, and the scribes were assembled. Peter had followed him at a distance, right into the courtyard of the high priest, and he was sitting with the guards, warming himself at the fire. Now the chief priests and the whole council were looking for testimony against Jesus to put him to death, but they found none. For many gave false testimony against him, and their testimony did not agree. Some stood up and gave false testimony against him, saying, "We heard him say, 'I will destroy this temple that is made with hands, and in 3 days I will build another, not made with hands.' But even on this point their testimony did not agree. Then the high priest stood up before them and asked Jesus, 'Have you no answer? What is it that they testify against you?' But he was silent and did not answer. Again the high priest asked him, 'Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One?' Jesus said, 'I am, and you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of the power, and coming with the clouds of heaven.' Then the high priest tore his clothes and said, 'Why do we still need witnesses? You have heard his blasphemy. What is your decision?' All of them condemned him as deserving death. Some began to spit on him, to blindfold him, and to strike him, saying to him, 'Prophesy.' The guards also took him over and beat him. While Peter was below in the courtyard, one of the servant girls of the high priest came by. When she saw Peter warming himself, she stared at him and said, 'You also were with Jesus, the man from Nazareth.' But he denied it, saying, 'I do not know or understand what you are talking about.' And he went out into the forecourt. Then the cock crowed, and the servant girl, on seeing him, began again to say to the bystanders, 'This man is one of them.' But again he denied it. Then after a little while the bystanders again said to Peter, 'Certainly you are one of them, for you are a Galilean.' But he began to curse, and he swore an oath, 'I do not know this man you are talking about.' At that moment the cock crowed for the 2nd time. Then Peter remembered that Jesus had said to him, 'Before the cock crows twice, you will deny me 3 times.' And he broke down and wept." So why would Judas have to kiss him? Because everybody knew who Jesus was. He'd been around that whole time.
Yeah, actually, I heard something interesting about that. One, it was dark. And so
Okay.
it might have been hard to recognize him. But also, there was a crowd from the chief priests, the scribes, and the elders. These might have been people who actually didn't know Jesus personally. They may have just been kind of on orders. So it's possible that they didn't super recognize him.
They didn't send their main people. Like, they just...
Yeah. Those are people just sort of following orders.
And a certain young man running
Yeah.
off naked. Like, what is that about?
So I've heard a couple things. One is that that's supposed to be Mark, but the better answer is that it represents the community ashamed and afraid. Because being naked, of course, was a shameful thing back in that time. Yeah. There's something I noticed when Jesus says, keep awake and pray that you may not come to the time of trial, and they keep falling asleep. Last week when we talked about Jesus saying, keep awake,
Oh, yeah.
keep watch, we were talking a little bit about the 70 AD thing. But actually another way to interpret it is at the time of his arrest and death, he's asking the disciples to keep awake, and they can't.
Yeah.
So that's really interesting.
Yeah, that is.
So when Jesus is before the council at night, it's not a kosher situation because it should have been done like in the daytime in regular hours.
So, like, they're being sneaky about
They're
it?
being sneaky about it, and they're getting false testimony, which it's interesting that they don't agree and they are arguing about it. And they're taking things he said but twisting it, which is a really interesting statement about lies. And even our perception of what we think is true is that it takes what's true and distorts it. But then they get Jesus by asking him if he's the Messiah, and when he says, I am, you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of the power, he's referring to like Old Testament things, and it makes him like feel elevated. And so they get really upset with him, and they're like, oh, that's what we needed. That's what we needed. Which is interesting because if the Messiah or the Son of Man was there, would they only acknowledge it was him if he literally floated down from the clouds?
And would they even then?
Yeah. Like, how do we know when we've seen what we're waiting for?
Yeah, good point.
That was a long chapter. The next one's not so long. Do you want to still read, or do you want me to read?
You go ahead.
Okay. As soon as it was morning, the chief priests held a consultation with the elders and scribes and the whole council. They bound Jesus, led him away, and handed him over to Pilate. Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" He answered him, "You say so." Then the chief priests accused him of many things. Pilate asked him again, "Have you no answer? See how many charges they bring against you." But Jesus made no further reply, so that Pilate was amazed. Now at the festival, he used to release a prisoner for them, anyone for whom they asked. Now a man called Barabbas was in prison with the rebels who had committed murder during the insurrection. So the crowd came and began to ask Pilate to do for them according to his custom. Then he answered them, "Do you want me to release for you the king of the Jews?" For he realized that it was out of jealousy that the chief priests had handed him over. But the chief priests stirred up the crowd to have him release Barabbas for them instead. Pilate spoke to them again. "Then what do you wish for me to do with the man you call the king of the Jews?" They shouted back, "Crucify him." Pilate asked them, "Why? What evil has he done?" But they shouted all the more, "Crucify him." So Pilate, wishing to satisfy the crowd, released Barabbas for them, and after flogging Jesus, he handed him over to be crucified. Then the disciples led him into the courtyard of the palace, that is, the governor's headquarters, and they called together the whole cohort. And they clothed him in a purple cloth, and after twisting some thorns into a crown, they put it on him. And they began saluting him, "Hail, King of the Jews!" They struck his head with a reed, spat on him, and knelt down in homage to him. After mocking him, they stripped him of the purple cloth and put his own clothes on him, and they led him out to crucify him. They compelled a passerby who was coming in from the country to carry his cross. It was Simon of Cyrene, the father of Alexander and Rufus. Then they brought Jesus to the place called Golgotha, which means place of the skull. And they offered him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it. And they crucified him and divided his clothes among them, casting lots to decide what each should take. It was 9 o'clock in the morning when they crucified him. The inscription of the charge read against him, "The King of the Jews," and with him they crucified 2 bandits, one on his right and one on his left. Those who passed by derided him, shaking their heads and saying, "Aha, you who would destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, save yourself and come down from the cross." In the same way the chief priests, along with the scribes, were also mocking him among themselves and saying, "He saved others, he cannot save himself. Let the Messiah, the King of Israel, come down from the cross now, so that we may see and believe." Those who were crucified with him also taunted him. When it was noon, darkness came over the whole land until 3 in the afternoon. At 3 o'clock, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, "Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani," which means, my God, why have you forsaken me?" When some of the bystanders heard it, they said, "Listen, he's calling for Elijah." And some ran, filled a sponge with sour wine, put it on a stick, and gave it to him to drink, saying, "Wait, let us see whether Elijah will come and take him down." Then Jesus gave a loud cry and breathed his last. And the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. Now when the centurion who stood facing him saw that in this way he breathed his last, he said, "Truly this was God's Son." There were also women looking on from a distance. Among them were Mary Magdalene, and Mary the mother of James the younger and of Joses, and Salome. These used to follow him and provided for him when he was in Galilee, and there were many other women who had come up with him to Jerusalem. When evening had come, and since it was the day of preparation, that is, the day before the Sabbath, Joseph of Arimathea, a respected member of the council, who was himself waiting expectantly for the kingdom of God, went boldly to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. Then Pilate wondered if he were already dead, and summoning the centurion, he asked him whether he had been dead for some time. When he learned from the centurion that he was dead, he granted the body to Joseph. Then Joseph brought the linen cloth, and taking down the body, wrapped it in the linen cloth and laid it in the tomb that had been hewn out of a rock. Then he rolled a stone against the door of the tomb. Mary Magdalene and Mary the mother of Joses saw where the body was laid.
So Barabbas. His name means something important. What is it again?
Son of the Father.
Oh.
I know, right? It's super ironic.
So he maybe was like in league with what Judas wanted, right? He was a zealot.
Yes.
So he had committed murder. Why had he not already been put to death? Like, here he's a murderer, someone who's actually trying to overthrow them. Much more a threat to them than Jesus was. I don't get it. Like,
It's possible that day would have been his execution day.
oh, okay, that's true.
Because the two, we call them two bandits, and we often call them two thieves. But actually a better translation is they were like Barabbas.
Okay.
So technically Jesus and the two bandits, they were all insurrectionists.
Okay.
So Barabbas should have been there where Jesus was.
He would have been that third one. Okay.
Which is actually interesting. I never thought of that Jesus takes the place of the opposite of him, the person everyone thought he was, a violent insurrectionist.
Who's the real son of the Father.
Yeah. And then in some ways, according to traditional understanding, we're all Barabbas, right? We're all the person who maybe should have received the execution, but Jesus took the spot.
Yeah.
Which is interesting.
How interesting would it be to know Barabbas' history after that?
Yeah.
It's just fascinating.
Yeah, right? Yeah.
And Pilate fascinates me. He's just an interesting character too. This one doesn't go into it, but like the whole thing with his wife's dream and washing his hands of the blood, like he clearly did not want to be responsible for Jesus' death. Like, why? He wasn't a good man either.
No.
Why did he care?
Honestly, there's some legends that say that Jesus affected Pilate positively. Other people are like, sometimes bad people are just bad people. Jesus didn't affect everyone. We know that. But I think one of the reasons why the Gospels tried to make it the chief priest's fault is because they still saw themselves as Jews.
Yeah.
So they wanted to say, look, it was we who killed Jesus. We can't blame this on the Romans. Unfortunately, of course, people have used that to be anti-Semitic, but the gospel writers still considered themselves Jews to some degree. So it felt like it was about them, not about the Jews. Yeah. So I think they're painting Pilate in a way where you just can't say, oh, it's all Pilate's fault.
Yeah.
If only he had been there, right? Yeah. So the only thing Jesus says on the cross in Mark is, my God, why have you forsaken, or why have you abandoned me? He doesn't say any of the other cool things. And so in some ways, people say in Mark, Jesus is the most human. He's the most like, he does amazing things, but in this moment, he is truly afraid and worried.
Which goes with what he said in the garden of, please take this.
Yeah. I think it's important to realize that, like, there's no sin in being afraid. There's no sin in being tempted. So the fact that he was terrified but still went through it just shows how much courage he had. And his commitment to his mission was more important than his own life.
Yeah.
And the last thing I'll say about this section is that there's like someone posted, they said, you know how we say that everyone abandoned Jesus? Nope, the women were there. The women did not abandon Jesus. But that part is constantly negated. Just like, oh, well, it's just the women.
Right.
They were disciples too. They were just not the 12. But Jesus had more than 12 disciples. Those were just sort of like maybe the closest ones. And so when they all ran away, the women stayed, which is really interesting.
Right. And it wasn't just these couple Marys. It said many other women.
Many other women. Yeah.
But those women wouldn't have been in the garden just because, like, Jesus didn't invite them, or they weren't at the Last Supper. Well, it makes it seem like at the garden it was Peter, James, and John, right?
Yeah.
And then like a few others were around.
We don't. Okay. All right. Before I say anything that I'm wrong with, unless it says the 12, he made preparations for the disciples. He came with the 12. Okay. Which is interesting because the Passover has always been a family meal. So it might have been, if he did just take the 12, they would have known something different was happening. And he probably couldn't have fit all his disciples into one room anyway. But maybe he did that because he was trying to impart some knowledge to them that was unique. But they probably would have had a feeling that something was weird.
Yeah.
Like, this is not how you do Passover. So yeah, and it's possible that the women heard later that Jesus was arrested, and then they rushed to the cross to watch him and to stay with him.
Because this all happened very quickly.
Yeah. Yeah, it would have been weird. They would have been like, we were just listening to
Right.
him in the temple.
Right.
And now,
Can you imagine, like, waking up that morning, he's already hanging on a cross?
yeah. 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 I wonder if the women were in any way mad at the male disciples for letting this happen and for not being there.
Mm-hmm.
If they were like, you guys
Right.
completely, yeah, where are you? You guys completely failed.
But wasn't John there? Doesn't one of the Gospels say, this is your mom now, this is your
John.
son?
Yeah.
John said
in the
that, of course.
Gospel of
Okay.
John. It's the only time. It's the
Okay.
only time. Yeah. Yeah. So in all the rest of the Gospels, it's only women.
Yeah.
Yeah. And Joseph of Arimathea, which is cool.
Yeah.
So he's a great example. He and Nicodemus are great examples, and even though Nicodemus isn't in this gospel, to realize that like it wasn't all the religious leaders that were the same in any way. They certainly all had differing opinions of Jesus and were probably arguing about who he was. So this last chapter, 16, is very short, and
Yes. And it has that weird funny part, right?
it
That
does.
Mark, yeah.
So most scholars believe that the true Mark gospel ends at the end of 8 with the women running away. And then there's a shorter ending of Mark and then a longer ending of Mark, which very much seems to be influenced by Luke and Matthew. That people think it was probably added by a scribe later because they didn't like the ending of Mark. It was too abrupt. So let's
Okay, I
Let's
can
find
read it.
out. Okay.
When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James, and Salome bought spices, so that they might go and anoint him. And very early on the first day of the week, when the sun had risen, they went to the tomb. They had been saying to one another, who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance to the tomb? When they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had already been rolled back. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man, dressed in a white robe, sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. But he said to them, do not be alarmed. You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has been raised. He is not here. Look, there is the place they laid him. But go, tell his disciples and Peter that he is going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you. So they went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. And all that had been commanded them they told briefly to those around Peter. And afterward Jesus himself sent out through them, from east to west, the sacred and imperishable proclamation of eternal salvation. Now, after he rose early on the first day of the week, he appeared first to Mary Magdalene, from whom he had cast out 7 demons. She went out and told those who had been with him, while they were mourning and weeping. But when they heard that he was alive and had been seen by her, they would not believe it. After this he appeared in another form to 2 of them, as they were walking into the country, and they went back and told the rest, but they did not believe them. Later he appeared to the 11 themselves, as they were sitting at the table, and he upbraided them for their lack of faith and stubbornness, because they had not believed those who saw him after he had risen. And he said to them, go into all the world and proclaim the good news to the whole creation. The one who believes and is baptized will be saved, but the one who does not believe will be condemned. And these signs will accompany those who believe. By using my name they will cast out demons. They will speak in new tongues. They will pick up snakes in their hands. And if they drink any deadly thing, it will not hurt them. They will lay their hands on the sick, and they will recover. So then the Lord Jesus, after he had spoken to them, was taken up into heaven and sat down at the right hand of God. And they went out and proclaimed the good news everywhere, while the Lord worked with them and confirmed the message by the signs that accompanied it. The first end is pretty abrupt.
Yeah.
But the longer does also feel a little too like just wrapped up nice.
And it doesn't even sound like Mark.
Right.
This whole time we've been reading a particular voice, and this feels like a different voice. And Jesus appearing to Mary Magdalene in 9 is like John. And then Jesus appearing to two of them walking in the country, that's from Luke.
Yep.
And then Jesus commissioning the disciples, that's actually from Matthew. And it also feels very specific in its theology, like the sacred and imperishable proclamation of eternal
Right.
salvation. Mark never says anything
I know,
like
that
that.
sounds really weird.
It's very churchy, like feels like it's hundreds of years later that a scribe added that. So, yeah. The whole snakes with their hands, of course, is where the snake handling comes from. And I heard something really interesting about that Jesus wasn't actually being literal about picking up snakes, because who cares? I'm not sure if I remember exactly what it was, but it was sort of like you'll be able to withstand danger.
Well, the drinking of the poison, too, it just feels weird.
Yeah. I mean, technically, so in the book I'm reading right now, the man who wrote it, Yogananda, he has his own guru and his guru's guru, and he's telling stories of all these gurus and things that they've seen, things he's personally witnessed, and then things his gurus have witnessed. And it's stuff like what Jesus does, which is kind of amazing.
Yeah.
Like
miracles?
Yeah. Like when one of the gurus dies, he appears in 3 different places in bodily form to his disciples to comfort them, and he says, "Touch me." I mean, every time I'm reading this book going, oh my gosh! But the point is he's saying, which is why he considers Jesus to be an ascended master and an enlightened guru, is when you get to that level, you completely understand on a deep, deep level that you are one with God and nature, and therefore you're not subject to the rules, or at least you're so aware of the rules that you can use them fully in a way we can't, which is why Jesus could walk on water and walk through walls. So they might read this and go, well, you could.
Yeah.
There was a story in the book of a disciple sitting with one of the masters, and a cobra came out onto the porch and was coming towards them, and the master started laughing and clapping, like, hey, 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 and the cobra came towards it, and of course the disciple was like, and it just went under their seat and went away. And he just had zero fear, because he was so connected with nature that he could somehow just influence the snake to be like, no,
Right.
you don't need to bite us, there's no reason. So technically, that would be possible, but that's master level.
Right.
That's like PhD level. And most of us are like 3rd grade.
Yes.
And I think that's why I get frustrated when people are like, well, if you have enough faith, you should be able to do X, Y, and Z. Okay, yes. But if you're saying that to a bunch of 2nd graders, and they'd have to practice to go up the different levels, let's start with something smaller and much more immediate, instead of us feeling like we should be able to jump into PhD work and then like chastise ourselves when we can't do it.
Because you do get that. I get that. Like, well, then why isn't my faith strong enough?
Yeah.
Right. And that's not helpful.
Yeah, and it's not. I almost think faith is not the best word. It's almost like your soul connection to God gets more and more powerful, that you start to see through everything, including how to bend the laws of space and time and death itself. Yeah. Which is fascinating.
Right. To be that connected to God, that you see the universe the way He does.
Yeah. And that you can literally co-create in the same way that God would. But like Jesus, you never do it for like selfish ambition.
Right. No.
You don't even do it for fun or to show off. You just only do it when you feel like you need to do it. Maybe to show what's possible. But yeah, I mean, I've tried to do different meditations when I was sick or, had something wrong of like healing light. And I don't know if any of it's ever worked. It's just, but the theory of it is possible. And I believe that maybe if I practiced an hour a day for the next 12 years, I might be able to heal my cold sore in a night, possibly. But I don't upbraid myself for my lack of faith because I just can't do it right now. Because honestly, I don't practice it. And I think that might be true for a lot of things. It's just, as Christians, we don't practice these things.
Yeah, we don't.
We talk more about ideas and maybe service and love, which is great. And I think for most people, that's probably all we need to do.
Well, and it almost feels like sacrilegious to talk about these things. Because, again, that was like drilled into me, like, only Jesus can do these things. But he even says that his disciples can, and it says they did heal people.
Yeah, they did. They did. I mean, Peter raises someone from the dead. So he says, you will do greater things than I. Jesus never talked about himself in the exclusive, save for John, but even the Hindus read that, and they don't see it as being exclusive. They see him as identifying with the Christ consciousness that anyone can eventually become enlightened enough to embody fully the Christ consciousness. Again, in my book, it's like Master Lahiri, a Christ-like life. They have no sense of, what's the word? Your God, my God, your book, my book. They're like, wisdom is wisdom, truth is truth. So Jesus was great. He did all these great things, and this guy was just like Jesus. And it kind of, because Christians are so drilled into thinking Jesus was different from us, we could never be like him, we suck.
Right.
Instead of Jesus was showing what's possible, and we can follow in his way. Not so that we feel bad that we can't do the same thing, but just, yeah. It's interesting.
To see what's possible, like if we allow ourselves to grow into that, like fullness. Yeah.
And I don't even think Jesus says, if you can't do these things, God is mad at you. He probably knows a lot of people will never be able to do it, but that there are some people who are so deep into that seeking and knowledge that they are able to embody that level of Christ consciousness. And then in like Buddhist Hindu terms, they're awake, they're enlightened, they've figured it out.
I feel so far from that.
I know. Yeah.
Awesome.
All right, well, we
Thank
finished
you.
Mark.
We did it.